Have you ever wondered if the people you love most are trying to tell you something without words, something you might not catch until it's too late? I have. I've asked myself that question 1,000 times since my grandfather, Walter, slipped away a year ago. At 85, he was the kind of man who'd weathered storms, literal ones, out on the Nebraska plains where he'd farmed corn for decades, and the quiet, creeping kind that age brings. I thought I knew him inside out, his calloused hands, his slow grin, the way he'd tip his hat to the wind like it was an old friend. But in his final year, he was sending me signals I didn't see, 6 subtle signs that his body was winding down, whispering goodbye while I stood there, blind to it all. If you've got someone you love growing older, stick with me, because these signs aren't loud, they're not obvious, and missing them can leave you with a regret that doesn't fade. Walter was a fixture in our lives, as steady as the golden fields stretching out behind his clapboard house near Kearney. He'd retired from farming years back, but he never really stopped, not in spirit. Even into his 80s, he'd shuffle out to the little garden patch he kept, a stubborn square of corn and beans he tended with a hoe older than me. I'm 55 now, and I drive up from Lincoln most weekends to check on him, my kids tumbling out of the car to chase the barn cats while I sat with him on the porch. He'd pull out his pocket watch, a tarnished silver thing his father gave him, and wind it slow, the ticking filling the gaps in our talk. "Still runs," he'd say, proud as if he'd built it himself. That watch was Walter, steady, reliable, a heartbeat you could set your life to. But age doesn't care about reliability, does it? It sneaks in, quiet as the frost that creeps over the fields in November. Walter started slowing down a couple years back. His steps got shorter. His shoulders hunched a little more under his flannel shirts. I chalked it up to time, to the way a body bends after 80-plus winters. My wife, Sarah, would nudge me sometimes, saying he's getting frail, but I'd brush it off. He's fine, I'd tell her. He's just old. And he was old in that tough, wiry way farmers get, the kind of old that still gets up at dawn even when there's no crop to check. I figured he had years left, plenty of time for me to sit with him, to listen to his stories about the Dust Bowl or the time he outran a tornado on his tractor. I was wrong. Started subtle, the way trouble always does. I'd pull up to the house one Saturday last spring, the kids piling out with their usual racket, and find Walter inside, not on the porch like always. He was in his armchair by the window, staring out at the fields, the wind rattling the panes with that Nebraska bite. His hands rested in his lap, the pocket watch dangling from its chain, unwound. "Not feeling up to it today?" I asked, dropping into the seat across from him. He shrugged, his eyes cloudy. "Just resting," he said, his voice a little thinner than I remembered. I didn't push it, didn't think I needed to. He'd bounce back, I told myself. He always did. But he didn't. Not really. Over the next few months, I started noticing things, small shifts I waved away as nothing. His jeans hung looser on his frame, the belt cinched tighter than it used to be. He'd doze off mid-conversation, his head dipping like the weight of staying awake was too much. He stopped asking about the kids. "No, how's little Jake's baseball going? Or did Ellie win that spelling bee?" Just silence where his questions used to be. I'd bring it up to Sarah on the drive home, and she'd frown, her hands tight on the wheel. "He's not himself," she'd say, but I'd counter with, "He's 85, what do you expect?" I didn't want to see it, didn't want to admit that maybe these weren't just quirks of age, that maybe they were warnings, quiet as the wind whispering through the corn. Looking back, I see them now, 6 signs, clear as day, that Walter was in his final year. I didn't know it then, but his body was talking, telling me he was slipping away, and I was too busy, too stubborn to listen. The first was his weight. He'd always been lean, but that spring he started shrinking, his cheeks hollowing out, his arms thin under the flannel. The second was exhaustion, not just tired, but a bone-deep weariness that kept him in that chair, away from the garden he loved. The third was withdrawal, the way he pulled back from us, from the world, like he was already half gone. There were 3 more to come, harder ones, But these started at the opening notes of a song I didn't want to hear. I remember one afternoon, late summer, the air thick with that heavy Nebraska heat. I found him in the kitchen, a bowl of soup cold on the table, his spoon untouched. "Not hungry?" I asked, and he shook his head, slow, like moving took effort. "Tastes like nothing," he muttered, pushing the bowl away. I laughed it off. "You're just picky now, Grandpa," and heated it up again, coaxing him to take a few bites. He did, but his hands trembled, the spoon clinking against the rim, and I looked away, pretending it was fine. It wasn't. That was the first sign staring me in the face, weight dropping, appetite fading, and I missed it. I missed the way his shirt hung like a sack, the way his belt notched tighter every time I saw him. I didn't know then what JAMA could have told me. Unexplained weight loss in the elderly often means the body's shutting down, unable to hold on to what it needs. I thought he'd just lost his taste for soup. The exhaustion crept in next, slow but relentless. He'd always been up before me. Even on those weekend visits, I'd find him puttering in the yard, checking the corn stalks with a farmer's eye. But by June, he was sleeping when I arrived, his head tipped back in that chair, a blanket slipping off his knees. "Long night," he'd say when I woke him. But it wasn't just one night, it was every day, naps stretching longer, his eyes sunken with a tiredness that rest couldn't fix. NIH studies call it a sign the body conserving energy as it nears the end, but I didn't read studies. I saw an old man napping, not a man whose strength was draining away. And then there was the quiet, the third sign, the one that hurt most to miss. Walter loved us loud, loved the kids' chaos, loved ribbing me about my city job, loved asking after every detail of our lives. But that summer, he stopped. I'd chatter on about Jake's home run or Ellie's new bike, and he'd nod, vague, his gaze drifting out the window. "That's nice," he'd say, and that was it. No questions, no spark. UCLA says social withdrawal spikes decline by 40%, a pulling away as the mind and heart retreat. I thought he was just moody, not fading from me. I sat with him that last August day, the sun sinking over the fields, painting the corn gold. He wound the pocket watch, his fingers fumbling the key, and let it tick in his palm. "Time's a funny thing," he said, soft, like he knew something I didn't. I nodded, not listening, not really. 3 signs were there, whispering, and 3 more were coming, louder, harder. I'd ignored the start of Walter's goodbye, too caught up in the noise of my own life to hear his silence. The wind picked up outside, rattling the house, and I looked at him, thin, tired, distant, and felt a shiver I couldn't name. It was regret, brewing slow, for all the warnings I didn't see and all the time I wouldn't get back. The Nebraska wind howls outside Walter's house that fall, tugging at the loose shingles, bending the corn stalks in his little garden patch until they bow like they're praying. I sit across from him in the living room, the pocket watch ticking faintly in his hand, its rhythm slower than I remember, or maybe that's just my imagination. It's September now, 6 months before he'd leave us, and I'm starting to see the cracks, the subtle shifts I'd ignored all spring and summer. 3 signs had already taken root. His weight dropping, his exhaustion pinning him to that armchair, his quiet pulling him away from me. I'd waved them off as age, as quirks, but they weren't done with him or me. 3 more were coming, and with them, a regret that's still carving its way through my chest. If you've ever wondered what you'd miss in someone you love, stay with me, because these signs were there, whispering, and I didn't listen until they screamed. The first sign had been gnawing at me for months, though I didn't name it then. Walter's frame was shrinking, not just leaner, but frail, like the wind could snap him in two. I'd show up with a bag of groceries, his favorite cornbread mix, a slab of bacon, some canned peaches, and find half of it still in the pantry weeks later. "Not much of an appetite," he'd say when I pressed him, his voice a shrug. I'd noticed his jeans sagging, the way his belt notched tighter every visit, but I told myself it was nothing. Old folks eat less, right? I'd heat up a plate anyway, sit with him at the kitchen table, watching him pick at it, a bite here, a sip there, his hands trembling as he lifted the fork. "Tastes like dust," he'd mutter once, pushing the cornbread away, and I'd laugh, thinking he was joking. He wasn't. I didn't know then what JAMA could have told me. Unexplained weight loss isn't just picky eating or a fading palate. It's the body slowing down, struggling to pull nutrients from food, letting muscle waste away as systems falter. Walter's arms, once thick from years of hauling hay, were thinning out, his cheeks sinking until I could see the shape of his bones. I'd catch him tightening that belt, his fingers fumbling, and think, he'll perk up soon. But he didn't. He was losing more than pounds. He was losing strength, energy, the fuel to keep going. And I missed it, every hollowed inch, because I didn't want to see what it meant. The second sign crept in alongside, heavy and unyielding. Walter's exhaustion wasn't just naps anymore, it was a weight that pinned him down, a fog he couldn't shake. I'd find him asleep in that chair every time I pulled up, the TV flickering static in the background. His head slumped like he'd fought to stay awake and lost. "Long day," he'd mumble when I nudged him. But there was no day, no garden to tend, no chores to finish. He'd shuffle to the kitchen, leaning on the counter to catch his breath, and I'd hover, asking, "You okay, Grandpa?" He'd nod, slow, his eyes half closed. "Just need a minute," he'd say, but minutes turned to hours, days to weeks. By October, he barely left that chair. The garden patch went wild, weeds choking the corn, and he didn't care, didn't even look at it. I tried to get him up, coax him outside for some air, but he'd wave me off. "Too tired," he'd say, sinking deeper into the cushions. NIH calls it a red flag, persistent fatigue in the elderly, the body hoarding energy as organs wind down, circulation weakens. His hands shook more, his steps faltered, and I'd catch him staring out the window, lost in a haze I couldn't reach. I thought he was resting, saving up strength. I didn't see he was running out of it, that every nap was a surrender, every "I'm fine" a lie I let myself believe. The third sign was quieter, but it cut deepest. Walter had always been our anchor, the one who'd ask about Jake's batting average, tease Ellie about her braids, grill me about my desk job like it was a personal offense. But that fall, he pulled away. I'd sit there, rattling on about the kids' school plays or Sarah's new recipe, and he'd just nod, no spark, no questions, no Walter. "Sounds good," he'd say, his voice flat, his eyes drifting to the fields like they held something I couldn't see. The kids would barrel in, loud as ever, and he'd smile faint, fleeting, but not call them over, not ruffle their hair like he used to. "They're growing," he'd mutter once, and that was it. I'd leave those visits feeling off, like I'd lost something I couldn't name. Sarah saw it too. "He's not asking about us anymore," she'd say, her brow creased, but I'd shrug. "He's just tired," I'd tell her, clinging to my own excuse. UCLA knows better. Social withdrawal's a warning, a 40% spike in decline when someone retreats from the world. Walter was slipping out of ours, piece by piece, and I didn't grab hold. I found a letter in his pocket watch later, half-written, ink smudged, addressed to Jake, and realized he'd wanted to reach out, but couldn't. He was fading from us, and I'd let him. These three signs, weight loss, fatigue, withdrawal, were there, plain as the Nebraska sky, and I brushed them off. I'd sit with him that fall, the wind howling, and watch him shrink into himself, thinking, "He's fine, he's just old." But he wasn't fine. He was signaling me, his body whispering what his words wouldn't. And here's where I need you if you're reading this. If any of this rings true for someone you love, stop for a second. Have you seen these signs too? Comment number 2 below if you're with me this far. Or tell me what's one change you've noticed in someone close that you didn't think twice about. I wish I'd thought twice. I'd give anything to go back and ask, to see, to listen, because 3 more signs were coming, and they'd break me open before I understood. I remember one day in November, the air sharp with frost, the fields brittle under a gray sky. Walter was in his chair, the pocket watch in his lap, its chain tangled in his fingers. I'd brought soup, thick beef stew, the kind he used to slurp down, but it sat cold on the table, untouched. Not today, he said when I nudged it closer, his voice barely above a whisper. I sat there, watching him breathe slow, shallow, like every inhale took effort, and felt a knot tighten in my gut. He wound the watch, his hands shaking so bad the key slipped, and I reached over, steadying him. Let me, I said, but he pulled back, stubborn as ever. I've got it, he rasped, and the ticking started, faint but there. That was Walter fighting to hold on, even as he slipped. I didn't see it then, didn't see the weight melting off him, the exhaustion chaining him to that chair, the way he'd stopped being part of us. I thought I had time to sit with him, time to ask about the letter, time to pull him back. I was wrong. The wind rattled the windows that day, a cold gust sneaking through the cracks, and I looked at him, thin, tired, distant, and felt something shift. 3 signs had passed me by, and 3 more were waiting, ready to show me what I'd missed. The pocket watch ticked on, steady in his trembling hands, counting down a clock I didn't know was running out. Winter clamps down on Nebraska that December, the kind of cold that seeps through the walls of Walter's old house and settles into your bones. I pull up the driveway, the gravel crunching under my tires, and see the garden patch buried under a thin crust of snow. No corn, no beans, just a ghost of what it used to be. Inside, Walter's in his armchair, the pocket watch cradled in his lap, its ticking faint against the howl of the wind outside. 3 signs have already carved their mark, his weight slipping away, his exhaustion rooting him to that chair, his silence pulling him from us, and I've missed them all, brushing them off as age, as nothing. But the story's not done. 3 more signs are coming, harder, louder, and they'll crash into me with a force I can't dodge. If you've ever wondered how close you are to losing someone, stay with me, because these were the warnings I couldn't ignore anymore. The 4th sign sneaks in with the frost, quiet at first but relentless. Walter's cough starts small, a dry hack I hear when I step through the door, his shoulders jerking with each one. Just a cold, he says when I ask, waving me off with a bony hand, but it doesn't stop. Days turn to weeks, and that cough digs in, rough and ragged, rattling through his chest like the wind through the bare trees outside. I bring him tea, honey stirred and thick, and he sips it, but the hacking comes back worse at night, he tells me, keeping him up. Can't shake it, he mutters one afternoon, his voice hoarse, and I notice his shirt's damp with sweat, his breathing shallow between fits. It's not just a cold. By January, he's weaker, his eyes dull, and I find a bottle of antibiotics on the counter half empty, prescribed after a doctor's visit I didn't know about. Lungs acting up, he says when I press him, but it's more than that. A week later, he's got a fever, low grade, stubborn, and I catch him wincing as he shifts in the chair. CDC calls it a pattern, repeated infections in the elderly, pneumonia or bronchitis creeping in as the immune system falters, too tired to fight. Walter's body isn't bouncing back, every cough steals a little more. Every pill does less. I thought it was winter, bad luck, not a sign he was breaking down. I was wrong, and it's tearing at me now, watching him fade under that blanket, the tea cold in his hands. The 5th sign hits harder, impossible to miss once I see it. Walter's breathing changes, not just from the cough, but all the time. I notice it one evening, sitting across from him, the room quiet except for the wind and that pocket watch. His chest rises slow, shallow, like he's sipping air instead of taking it in. Sometimes it stops, a pause, too long, before a quick gasp catches it back, and my heart stutters every time. You okay? I ask, leaning forward, but he nods, faint, his lips tight. Fine, he says, but he's not. His hands are cold when I touch them, fingers pale against the watch's silver, and his feet tucked under a quilt feel like ice even through his socks. I start watching closer, and it's everywhere, the way he pants after shuffling to the kitchen, the way his voice fades mid-sentence, catching his breath like it's a chore. One night, he coughs hard, doubling over, and I hear it a wheeze, thin and sharp, cutting through the room. Hospice Foundation nails it. Circulation slowing, the heart pumping weaker, blood pooling away from the extremities as the body clings to what's vital. His nose tips blue sometimes, his toes too, and I'd pull the quilt higher, thinking it's the cold. It's not. It's his lungs, his heart, his everything winding down, and I'm sitting there helpless, watching the man who taught me to breathe deep slip away one shallow gasp at a time. The sixth sign is the cruelest, the one that rips the ground out from under me. Walter's mind starts fraying, threads of him unraveling where I can't reach. It's subtle at first. He forgets where he parked his old truck, sold years ago, and asks me about it one afternoon. "Out back, right?" he says, squinting like he can see it through the snow. I laugh, gentle, correcting him. "No, Grandpa, we sold that," and he nods, but his eyes cloud over. Then it's names he calls Jake, Tommy once, a kid from his past, and I let it slide. "Close enough," I say, but it's not funny anymore when he turns to me one evening, the watch ticking in his hand, and says, "Who are you again?" My stomach drops, a cold sweat breaking out. "It's me, Grandpa," I say, my voice cracking, leaning close so he can see my face. He blinks, slow, and mutters, "Oh, right," but there's a blankness there, a hole where I used to be. Nature aging has it pegged, oxygen's not reaching the brain, circulation's failing, and memory slips away, 30% faster when the body's shutting down. He forgets the kids' birthdays, forgets the soup I brought an hour ago, forgets me, his own flesh and blood, for seconds that stretch into eternity. I'd sit there, holding his hand, willing him to remember, but he'd drift, staring at the fields like they're calling him home. I thought it was tiredness, old age playing tricks. It was his mind saying goodbye, and I didn't hear it. These three signs: infections, breathing, confusion, pile on top of the first three, and I'm drowning in them, still too stubborn to see. I'd bundle him up, brew more tea, tell myself he'd rally. He's Walter, he always rallies. But he doesn't, and it all comes crashing down one frigid February morning. I pull up early, the sky a bruised gray, and find the back door ajar, snow dusting the floor. "Grandpa?" I call, my voice tight, and then I see him sprawled in the garden patch, the hoe in his hand, the pocket watch glinting in the snow beside him. He'd tried to get out there, to tend his corn one last time, and he'd fallen hard, his breath a ragged wheeze as I drop to my knees beside him. "Hold on," I say, my hands shaking as I lift him, his body light as a husk, his skin cold under my fingers. The watch's face is cracked, the hands frozen, and his eyes cloudy. Lost meet mine for a second before fluttering shut. I carry him inside, shouting for Sarah to call someone, anyone, but he's limp, his cough a weak echo, his breath stuttering like a candle in the wind. "I'm here," I whisper, cradling him on the couch, the quilt pulled tight, but he doesn't answer, doesn't know me. The ambulance comes too late. He's alive, barely, but fading fast, and I sit there, the watch in my hand, its ticking stopped, knowing I've missed it all. 6 signs: weight, exhaustion, withdrawal, infections, breathing, confusion, and this fall is the breaking point. I'd ignored them, every one, thinking time was on my side. It wasn't. Walter hangs on a month more, but he's gone, not the man I knew, not the farmer who'd outlasted storms. I hold his hand in the hospital, the beep of machines drowning out the silence I'd missed, and feel the regret sink in heavy, sharp, final. He'd been warning me, his body screaming what his voice couldn't, and I'd turned away. The wind rattles the windows that day, a mournful howl, and I clutch that broken watch, its stillness a mirror to my failure. 3 signs started it, and 3 finished it, and now I've got to face what's left. The hospital room smells like antiseptic and regret. A sterile white box where Walter lies under a thin blanket, his chest rising and falling in fits and starts. It's late February now, the Nebraska wind clawing at the windows, rattling them like it's trying to break in. I sit beside him, the broken pocket watch in my hand, its cracked face staring back at me, a silent witness to the fall that shattered everything. 6 signs had screamed at me for a year: his shrinking frame, his endless fatigue, his retreat from us, the infections that wouldn't quit, his faltering breath, his fading mind, and I'd missed them all until he crumpled in that snowy garden patch. He's been here a month, slipping further every day, and I'm left with the pieces of grandfather I didn't save, a lesson I learned too late. But it's not over yet. If you've ever wondered what you'd do with the time you have left, stay with me, because Walter's final days taught me something I can't unlearn, something I need to share. He doesn't talk much now, hasn't since the fall, his voice lost to the cough that still rattles his chest, weak but stubborn. The doctors say it's pneumonia, the 4th sign come back to finish what it started, his immune system too worn to fight. CDC had warned me infections hit harder when the body's winding down. A cycle of sickness that doesn't break, but I didn't see it then. I see it now, in the 4 dripping into his arm, the oxygen mask fogging with every shallow breath. His hands are cold, the 5th sign etched in their icy grip, circulation failing as his heart stumbles. I rub them between mine, trying to warm them, but they stay stiff, pale, the blue tint creeping up his fingers like frost on the fields. His mind's the worst, the 6th sign, the one that guts me every time. He doesn't know me most days, his eyes drifting past my face, searching for something I can't give. Where's the truck? He'll mumble, or Tommy's late, and I'll swallow hard, saying, "It's me, Grandpa, it's just us." Sometimes he nods, a flicker of recognition, but it fades fast, nature aging's truth playing out oxygen-starved. His brain's letting go, 30% of him slipping away with every missed beat. I'd missed it all: the weight he couldn't keep, the exhaustion he couldn't shake, the family he couldn't hold on to, and now he's here, a shadow of the man who'd wrestled storms and won. But I can't sit in regret forever. Walter wouldn't want that. He taught me to fix what's broken, to plant even when the soil's hard, and I owe him that much. So I start small, fighting the signs I'd ignored. The weight loss, I can't bring it back, but I can make him comfortable. I bring broth, warm and light, spooning it past his cracked lips when he'll take it. Tastes better, he rasps once, a ghost of a smile, and I cling to it, knowing Jamma was right, his body can't process much, but comfort matters. The nurses nod, approving, and I sit there, feeding him slow, watching the lines on his face soften for a moment. The fatigue's tougher, NIH says it's his body conserving what's left, and I see it in the way he sleeps, hours stretching into days. I stop pushing him to wake up, stop filling the silence with chatter he can't follow. Instead, I sit quiet, letting him rest, the pocket watch in my palm as I count the ticks he can't hear. One afternoon, I bring a quilt from home, the one his wife made, patched with old flannel, and drape it over him. His breathing steadies just a little, and I think maybe he feels it, the weight of something familiar holding him close. The withdrawal, that 3rd sign, stings deepest, but I fight it too. He'd pulled away, stopped asking, stopped being Walter, and UCLA pegged it a 40% slide when connection fades. I can't drag him back, but I can meet him where he is. I talk soft about the fields he loved. Remember the year the corn grew taller than me? And his eyes flicker, a spark in the haze. I bring Jake and Ellie once, their voices low, and he stirs, muttering, "Good kids," his hand twitching like he wants to reach out. They leave drawing stick figures in a field, and I tape them to the wall, a bridge to the family he'd lost. The infections keep coming, a fever spikes. His cough worsens, but I focus on what I can do. I keep his lips moist with ice chips, his skin clean with a warm cloth, easing the strain CDC says he can't fight. The nurses take over the heavy stuff, antibiotics, fluids, but I'm there, a steady hand when the fever makes him shiver. His breathing's next, the 5th sign, ragged and uneven, and I adjust the pillows, propping him up when the mask isn't enough. Hospice foundation taught me late. Circulation's failing, but comfort's king. I hold his cold hands, rub his feet, whisper, "I've got you," and hope he hears. The confusion, that sixth, brutal sign I tackle last. He forgets me, forgets everything, but I don't stop. I bring the pocket watch, cracked but precious, and wind it slow. It's ticking, a lifeline to who he was. "You gave me this," I lie, "it's his, always was," but his eyes lock on it once. Clear for a second. Still runs, he whispers, and my throat closes up. I tell him stories, the tractor race, the storm he outran, and he hums, faint, like he's there again. Nature aging, says it's slipping away, but I give him something to hold, a thread to the past. March comes, the wind softening outside, and Walter's slipping faster, breath shallow. Hands ice, mind gone. I've done what I can, fighting six signs with too little, too late, but there's one last moment. I take the watch to a jeweler, get it fixed, the crack stays, but the hands move again and bring it back. I wind it, set it in his palm, and his fingers curl around it, weak but sure. "Time's funny," he breathes, the words from months ago, and I nod, tears burning. "Yeah, Grandpa, it is." His eyes meet mine, clear, sharp, Walter, and he smiles, small but real. "Good boy," he says, and I break, holding his hand as the ticking fills the room. He's gone 2 days later, peaceful, the watch still in his grip. I sit there, the quilt over his chest, the drawings on the wall, and feel the weight, not just loss, but peace. I'd missed the signs, let regret swallow me. But these last weeks, I'd fought for him: broth, rest, stories, warmth, presence, time. 6 signs took him, but they gave me something too, a chance to say goodbye, to make it right in the end. Spring breaks over Nebraska now, the fields greening up, the wind carrying seeds where Walter's corn once stood. I keep that watch, ticking on my shelf, and think of him, not the shell in the hospital, but the man who'd taught me to listen. I'd ignored the whispers: weight, fatigue, withdrawal, infections, breath, confusion, and paid for it with a year I can't reclaim. But I learned, late but true, those signs aren't just warnings. They're windows to care, to love, to hold on while you can. I walk the garden patch sometimes, the kids running ahead, and hear his voice in the rustle of the stalks still runs. He's gone, but I'm not, and neither are you. 6 signs nearly broke me, but they rebuilt me too, wiser, ready to see. I look at the watch, its hand steady, and wonder, what will you do with the time you've got left? The wind answers, soft and sure, carrying his lessons forward and mine, if you'll take them.